at the end of the program. All right, Paul, it's all you.
All right, thank you, Alex. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We are in a second part of a series of presentations about the history of the Workman and Temple families, Greater Los Angeles. And we're talking about the time period of 1830 to 1930. So this is titled Life During Wartime. The first part of the series, was about the families arriving in Greater Los Angeles in the late 1820s up to the early 1840s. So we are moving into an era which is the end of the Mexican period here in Los Angeles. And a big focal point of this will be the Mexican-American War, the role the families played during that conflict, and other aspects of their lives during that decade. So a lot of us remember the term manifest destiny in school at one point or another. And this was a concept that many people had in the United States, which was mostly east of the Mississippi in those days. And the idea was that the country would have to expand, or had a destiny to expand, a God-given right in some cases, to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific, sea to shining sea. Of course, there were some people in the way of that. The indigenous people, for example, who had been gradually pushed further west or had died in conflicts or what have you, including the Trail of Tears, which took a lot of the native people from the southeastern United States into areas like Oklahoma and more in the Midwest location. And of course, there was also the large Republic of Mexico. This map shows the boundaries of Mexico prior to the independence declared by Americans in Texas in 1845. So this area, pink area here, shows what that republic boundaries were like between 1836 and 1845. And then the rest of northwestern Mexico, embracing parts of New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Colorado and Utah, as well as California. A lot of people don't remember or don't know that there were also conflicts with Great Britain. In fact, war almost broke out in the 1840s in a couple different areas. One would be way up in New England, up towards Maine, where there were some boundary conflicts. The other was the area of Oregon and Washington in the Pacific Northwest, and try to decide where the boundaries were going to be there. So the country was expanding. The political system was getting more confident about its ability to expand and to confront other countries or other peoples who were in their way. So it's important to kind of lay that groundwork as we talk about what was happening during that decade. I refer to this area being Alta California as opposed to Baja California, which of course is still part of Mexico. Alta California is the Siberia of Mexico, a term I came across years ago. I wish I could remember where I got it from, but I can't. And it's apt, I think, because it talks about the fact that this was such a remote area. The distance wasn't just miles from Mexico City, it was how you got here. The native peoples of northern Mexico had always been obviously protective of their territory. And so there were many periods of time where it was difficult, if not impossible, for people to travel overland from the interior parts of Mexico up to Alta California. So people had to take ocean voyages, but even that was tricky. Currents and other conditions in the ocean could often make it treacherous to make that trip as well. So there was an isolation here that led the Spanish-speaking Californios to refer to themselves by that as Californios, not necessarily Mexicanos, because they had that self-sufficiency that was born out of distance, isolation, lack of support from Mexico. It's also important to bear in mind that Mexico was still a new country. By 1840, it had only been around for about 20 years, and almost any new nation is going to struggle to establish themselves, whether it's internal divisions in Mexico, for example, the church, the military, the landowners, the politicians in Mexico City, a lot of conflicts that happened in the United States too in its early days. What it led to in Mexico, though, were frequent revolutions. It seemed like almost every year or two, there were civil wars taking place in Mexico City, and these different factions fighting each other. The presidency changed hands frequently, and it was just an unstable type of arrangement. The other thing to remember, of course, when you look back to this map, is Mexico City is way down here. The idea of trying to limit the incursions of other people in these areas was really an impossible task. Obviously, the United States was expanding here and the coastal areas were also at risk. In 1842, an American naval squadron pulled into Monterey under the mistaken assumption that war had been declared between the two countries. That had been a rumor for quite a long time. And so Captain Thomas Ap Catesby Jones took Monterey by force, raised the American flag, realized his mistake, took the flag down, put the Mexican flag back up, apologized, and left. But it was really an ominous sign, obviously, for those people living in Alta California, just how fragile their condition and their position was, because the United States was really aggressively moving into the Pacific area. And that did happen 4 years after Jones made his mistaken conquest of Monterey, which was the capital of Alta California at that time. Los Angeles, meanwhile, was the largest of really only a couple of towns that existed. As you may know, there were three parts of the expansion of Europeans in Alta California: the Spanish first and the Mexicans, meaning the missions, of which we know a lot more because there were a lot more of them. They were more successful in their operations. There were 21 of those. Then you had presidios, or military outposts, and there were several. So for example, there was one in Santa Barbara, the presidio in San Francisco was another one. There were a few others. And then the towns, or the pueblos, San Jose was the first in 1777, followed 4 years later by Los Angeles. There was one called Branciforte in the late 1790s that failed to take hold. It eventually became Santa Cruz. But that really highlighted the difficulty. It was easier to have missionaries volunteer to go to California and do what they were going to do. The military was a little tougher because Mexico didn't have a lot of military personnel to spare necessarily, or funds. But even the colonists, it was hard to get people to come up here. A lot of those colonists who came to Los Angeles in the 1780s were from the northern Mexican states, Sinaloa, Sonora, people who were already in Baja California. So there were not a lot of them, and the town grew slowly. By the 1840s, there were still just maybe 1,000 roughly people living in the pueblo, and maybe 2,000 in the entire district, which spanned from the ocean out to the inland areas down into what is now Orange County, San Fernando Valley, that sort of thing. So a sparsely populated area. And again, that's why the Siberia of Mexico phrase is pretty compelling. Now, the families, as I mentioned in the first talk, came here in different time periods. Jonathan Temple, pictured here from Massachusetts, was in Hawaii as a merchant for several years before landing in San Diego in 1827. He came to Los Angeles the year after that, the second foreigner or estranjero to live in Los Angeles. He was the first person to open a store because, again, it was a self-sufficiency thing. Most people either raised or grew what they needed, or they could trade directly with those ships that would anchor off the coast, mostly at San Pedro, and do that direct kind of contact. Temple was really the first middleman, opening his store in the pueblo at the corner of Main and Spring Street, where Los Angeles City Hall stands today. And he built a pretty successful operation with his store over the course of about 30 years. This is one of the buildings he built on that location where City Hall is today, two-story adobe skyscraper for the time. Most people had one-story homes and businesses in these early years. And that's probably him there in the frock coat and his top hat, shaking hands with somebody. So he was quite successful in his work as a merchant, also had trading and contacts with people up and down California and Monterey, for example. He had had the background in Hawaii, so he had already had years of experience in this and allowed him to become quite successful. He was referred to by a later merchant, Harris Newmark, one of the early arrivals from Europe, Jews who came out in the late 1840s into the 1850s to the United States seeking better opportunities for themselves. And Newmark established himself as a merchant around the time that Temple was in his later years, but he referred to Temple as a very rich, if miserly, man in his book. So often people who are able to attain wealth are going to want to keep that by being miserly, if that was a correct assumption by Newmark. But Temple also expanded into landholding. And what you would have to do is become a Roman Catholic and a Mexican citizen. Or if you chose not to do that, you could marry into a family and then through your spouse be able to acquire property. Temple was baptized a Roman Catholic in San Diego before coming to Los Angeles and was a Mexican citizen. So he could do this on his own, but he bought a property through his wife. She had some relatives who owned the Rancho Los Cerritos. We know this area as Long Beach, surrounding locations. It was about 27,000 acres between what it was now between the San Gabriel River and the Los Angeles River, which is over here. At the time he bought this in the 1840s, the San Gabriel River was actually the Rio Hondo, and that emptied into the LA River going through his property or just above it perhaps. But in any case, it was a pretty substantial rancho, one of the largest in the area. To the west is Rancho San Pedro and Palos Verdes. To the east would be Los Alamitos, Los Coyotes in Orange and Los Angeles counties. The Pueblo would be to the north of Los Angeles. So he had a very good location in terms of raising cattle for their hides and tallow, and then being able to take them just a short distance down to the rudimentary port at San Pedro down here at the bottom left so that he could have his product shipped out. That was really the basis of the economy in the 1830s, 40s especially, where the raw hides and the tallow or fat of the cattle were shipped out to be rendered into leather goods, soap and candles. In some cases, those things even being brought back to be sold here. They really didn't have manufacturing on a large scale to do any of that, not even the leather working or the candle and soap making. That was usually done in other places. But he had a prime property down here. And over time, he was expanding his business empire in this little outpost of Mexico. In the meantime, Jonathan, who was born in the late 1790s, had a visitor, his 19-year-old half-brother. They were 26 years apart in age. Jonathan had left Reading, Massachusetts, their hometown north of Boston, before his younger brother was born. And this fellow's name was Pliny Fisk Temple. And he arrived here in 1841, evidently to visit his brother for maybe a year and then go back home. But he decided to stay, remained in the area. He was called Templito by the locals because he was the younger of the two brothers. It was often said it was because he was 5 feet 4 inches tall. And that was a little shorter than average. And his brother probably was a little taller than that. But the Templito, I think, was probably more because he was the younger brother. And he began to get himself established by being clerk in his brother's Los Angeles store. One of his early business endeavors, kind of an indicator of what he was interested in doing with his life later on, was there was a small gold rush, not like the bigger one that took place up north several years later, but in an area called Spitzzeri the Canyon, and it's called that because the placer was a way of mining for gold. Spitzzeri the Canyon is east of Santa Clarita and Newhall on your way up to the Antelope Valley. And there was a discovery of gold in spring 1842. Pliny had arrived here the prior summer, so he hadn't been here very long when that discovery was made. And he immediately seized an initiative and bought some of the gold dust and had it sent back to the East Coast. There was a brother of the Temples who was still in Reading, and both of them actually used him to send things back and also help them get goods to take back to California to be sold in the store and so forth. And so Pliny did that with the gold dust, had that sold back by his brother. So he was only 20 when that happened, but he was starting to show a little bit of business initiative. Meanwhile, William Workman and his family arrived in the Los Angeles area at the end of 1841, about 5 months after Pliny got here. Pliny, like his brother, came to Los Angeles by sea. Actually went to Monterey, took a ship down to Santa Barbara, and then overland to Los Angeles. But the Workmans were already living inland. They were in New Mexico. William had gone from his native England in his 20s to Missouri to join a brother who was living there. Then he went to New Mexico, settled in Taos, did some fur trapping, and became owner of a store there. And he was living what we think was probably a pretty comfortable life from the 1820s, mid-1820s until the early 1840s. But there were political problems involving the expansion of Texas, as I mentioned earlier, as that republic was looking to move its western boundary to the Rio Grande River and really to cut into most of New Mexico. That caused a lot of political problems there. And Workman, his friend and business partner, John Rowland, a guy named Benjamin D. Wilson, whose namesake observatory is being threatened right now by fire, and other Americans, Europeans, and New Mexicans all traveled to Los Angeles. So this is the third time William was making a move, and hopefully, I'm sure he thought it would hopefully be his last move. So here's where he had been living from the mid-1820s to the early 1840s in Taos. This was the northernmost of the major population areas of New Mexico. It was closer to the fur trapping areas of the Rocky Mountains. So it was really a place where a lot of fur trappers would hang out in the winter and into the spring before they'd go out and do their expeditions. So Workman's store was doing quite well there. Santa Fe was the capital. And then to the south, misspelled, Albuquerque, which was actually the largest of the three communities. But if you look at the populations, 5,000 Albuquerque, 3,000 Santa Fe, 2,000 Taos, far more people in that outpost of Mexico than were in Alta California. In any case, what was called the Roland Workman Expedition, or the Workman and Roland Party, left Santa Fe in September 1841. Didn't go very far along this route when they got to Abiquiu, where a lot of New Mexican Genezados, who were mixed native and Spanish people, joined on. And then the group continued on this road called the Old Spanish Trail. It was neither, actually. It was only 12 years old and wasn't started until the Mexican era, but it was a commercial caravan route from Santa Fe to Los Angeles and back. The Workman and Roland folks were the first to use that on a large scale for immigration out here. The reference up here to extra baggage is that not only did they carry their worldly goods with them, but Workman had that reputation, and Roland too, of being involved in some political intrigue involving that plan of Texas to essentially invade New Mexico. They left before that expedition left Austin and made its way over the long stretches of desert. They wound up being very badly organized, poorly supplied, and basically pooped out before they got into Santa Fe. And the New Mexican authorities were able to sweep in and arrest and disperse the expedition pretty quickly. But once Workman and Roland had left, the governor of New Mexico sent word via a trade caravan that was ahead of them, a letter to the Californios, in which he warned them that Workman and Roland were going to come out to, quote, seduce and confuse California's inhabitants. And so this was evidently an attempt to try to get the Californios to not welcome these folks into their territory. It didn't work, actually. Roland and Workman did arrive with their fellow travelers. Some of them were not intending to stay in California. In fact, Wilson, just as one example, was hoping to catch a ship to China, went up to Monterey and literally missed the boat. It had just sailed before he got there. So he wound up coming back to Los Angeles and stayed and became a pretty prominent guy. Other people in that group settled in the Baca family, for example, from New Mexico, settled what is now Vacaville, northeast of San Francisco. So there were quite a few people in this group. But in the case, the idea that there was a plot to cause some kind of problem in California did not materialize. And the explosive plot is a bit of a play on words. Maybe you can pick it out from this plaque here. Workman was British, and he arrived on November 5th, 1841, had this glass plaque made for a door at his house. And because November 5th is an important British holiday called Guy Fawkes Day that most of us don't know anything about, it involved a plot to blow up Parliament and overthrow the monarchy back in the 17th century. John Roland was really the principal figure in that expedition. He's the one who presented the list of members to the authorities in California, identifying names, ages, and occupations of the males, and of the few households, only the household male involved. So we didn't get the names of women or children or others. And then Roland went up to Monterey in early 1842 and petitioned for a land grant for a rancho called La Puente. Now, he had known about this prior because in 1834, 8 years before, Roland purchased some horses from the rancho. So that connection between New Mexico and California with the Old Spanish Trail and the trade network definitely was part of the history even before they got out here. And often it was woolen goods, blankets and so forth that were sent from New Mexico and then traded for horses and mules who were sent back east. So the fact that Roland probably sent out things like some woolen goods to California and then had those horses purchased, or just did it through cash, it may have been that as well, but it gave him some understanding of what was already out here. Now, Rancho La Puente was named because when the Spanish expedition led by Gaspar de Portola, and that's how it's pronounced, Portola, came through the area in 1769. They crossed the Puente Hills down here at the bottom from what is now Orange County, and they encountered the Arroyo San Jose, or San Jose Creek, which is now a flood control channel, and had enough water where they had to build a bridge of poles across it. They were Catalonians, so in their version or dialect of Spanish, they would use the feminine or masculine article. So La Puente did mean the bridge, as explained in the diaries of people like Father Juan Crespi. And then the expedition moved forward. That name, La Puente, stuck. And so it became one of the many ranchos of the San Gabriel mission, which is depicted here on the left. And in its heyday, the Mission San Gabriel owned property all the way out to San Bernardino. So many of the ranchos that were in between La Puente, Azusa, San Jose, which is now Pomona, Rancho Cucamonga, and so forth, were part of the mission system. We know, for example, that about in the middle of the rancho, there was a large granary that had been built by the mission fathers. They raised lots of wheat and other crops, as well as raised cattle and horses. And the granary was situated for a reason. It's because the native peoples of this area had a large village, Avigna, that was located either next to the San Jose Creek, or perhaps when it flooded, they would move a little bit to the north. So where La Puente High School is, for example, that has been identified as one of the native villages. So it was choosing a location, obviously, where you had the labor force. Now, the native peoples were part of the mission labor force through force in almost every case. Sometimes it was a matter of the Spanish introducing animals that would eat up native plants, or introducing plants that would crowd out native plants. And almost because they had to, because of starvation, natives would flock to the missions trying to find a way to survive. In doing so, they often found themselves victims of corporal punishment for not following rules that were imposed upon them by the Spanish. And also disease took a dramatic toll. Almost any indigenous people in the world who were encountered by an outside group had that problem of introduced diseases, for example. Now, those indigenous people had a wide area, and the territory would roughly go as far south as, say, San Juan Capistrano, or a bit around there, into the Inland Empire area, out towards the San Fernando Valley, some of the Channel Islands, up into the San Gabriel Mountains, and so forth. Different terms get used. Gabrieleño or Gabrielino is one that you see quite a bit. For example, I like to use the words indigenous or native frequently, but in any case, you have these various villages here. So here is Avigna, again, located on Rancho La Puente. To give you an example, some of the other ones close by, Azuxa or Azuxagna, which is where the name Azusa came from. That's not A to Z in the USA, which is something you often hear. That's a native name. Cucamonga or Cucamonga being another one. And there are many such examples, Topanga. So sometimes you can see those names still with us today. But there was a large population. And of course, they're going to congregate wherever you have significant sources of water. So San Jose Creek for Avigna, the San Gabriel River for several of the villages close by, or the Los Angeles River, obviously. And so when Workman and Roland obtained, or Roland really, initially obtained the grant to Rancho La Puente early in 1842, one of the conditions of any land grant under Spain and Mexico was that you had to take care of the native peoples of your rancho. Now, that was all it really said. I'm sure nobody checked to see just how well the natives were taken care of by these people. Having said that, there is almost no evidence that we know of how the Indians of La Puente were cared for, or much anything else about them. The only thing I've ever seen is that William Workman built a church on his property in his cemetery, and the man who designed it said it was built for the benefit of the Indians, and that they were paid 50 cents a day. That's all I've ever really seen in mention of the native peoples on Rancho La Puente, unfortunately. But it is important, of course, to recognize, remember, and continue to talk about the idea that the native peoples were here for time immemorial before anybody else showed up. So the establishment of the family, and by the way, I was going to mention this too, when Roland got the land grant in 1842, he had left his family back in New Mexico. So what he did is he got the property secured. There was a survey done for that. And these are lines that were drawn by one of the gentlemen who came with Workman and Roland on their expedition. His name was Isaac Given. Given was a surveyor by trade. So he actually drew a pretty precise survey map. Most of the expedientes, the documents you would have for these land grants, have maps that don't really show, and their diseños is what the name is, don't really show much detail like this, and not particularly precise, but they didn't have to be. For people in Spanish Mexican California, the understanding was, as you knew the boundaries by things like a tree or a rock or something placed at various locations to identify what the boundaries were. Given had some training. So this is one of the few I've ever seen that had straight identified lines in the survey. The rancho was granted by Governor Juan Bautista Alvarado at 18,000 acres, 4 square leagues. It was not the entirety of the rancho, actually. And it even said the excess would remain with the government. And so it's still a large property, but not as big as it would wind up becoming. Roland then goes back to New Mexico in spring 1842 to get his family. He returned at the end of that year. In the meantime, Workman chose a location very close to that granary, also very close to the creek right in here, to establish himself. And he wrote a letter to Roland in April 1842, once Roland had already left. And I guess Workman had a courier or somebody who was going to travel back there, maybe one of the caravans going back to New Mexico, take that letter. And he told Roland, I have settled here on the Little River, meaning the rancho, the San Jose Creek, and said he was satisfied with what he was doing. Now they were settling in this when it was not the best weather to build an adobe house yet. So there was a temporary structure built by the Workman family. And then when the summer came, they began to build what is still part of our Workman house on the Homestead Museum property today. He also planted a crop of corn and beans, began to buy some animals to stock the ranch, and began to establish themselves on their property. A couple of years later, and who knows how this happened, I imagine the Workman family was traveling into Los Angeles periodically, stopping in at the Temple store to buy goods and what have you. And because Pliny was the clerk, and perhaps that's where he met Margarita Workman, her full name Antonia Margarita Workman, one of the 2 children of William and his wife Nicolasa, who was a Taos native. They married in 1845, Pliny and Margarita did, and it was the first marriage in Greater Los Angeles where both parties had English language surnames, Workman and Temple. It just illustrates how few people there were from the United States or Europe in those years, probably 50 to 100 by the end of the Mexican period. So it was a pretty small community. And that marriage not only brought the families together, obviously in a personal way, but Pliny and his father-in-law, William Workman, would become business partners, expanding that over time. I mentioned earlier that in Mexico proper, there were frequent civil wars, unrest between landowners and between the military, and between the politicians and the church, and revolts were frequent, and presidency changed hands quite a bit. That could happen too in their outlying outposts. Now the areas like New Mexico, Texas, and California were called departments. That was the official term that was utilized. And in the Department of Alta California, there were occasional conflicts, but a lot of this had to do with whether or not the central government in Mexico City sent up a governor to run things, as opposed to allowing the Californios to choose their own. So you can imagine what's going to happen with that. Anytime the Mexico City and the government there sent someone up, the Californios tended not to like that. And invariably, there would be a revolt, and that governor would be sent packing back to Mexico. Sometimes, though, the conflicts were kind of a natural, and we still even see today, if not militarily, at least in other ways, which is the division between North and South. So Monterrey was the capital of Alta California for most of that history in Spain and Mexico. And so because it was the capital, it asserted that kind of authority. But in Los Angeles, which was a bigger community, more people, they were chafing at that. They wanted more control of things locally. In 1844, Pio Pico, who was the head of the small legislature, the assembly, decided he was going to challenge the leadership of Manuel Micheltorena, who had been sent from Mexico City a couple of years before. Micheltorena was not popular, not only because of that, but he brought an armed guard with him that the locals were not happy with. They thought there was a lot of excessive use of force and behaviors and what have you. So Pico decided to challenge Micheltorena, who marched down from Monterrey. They had a battle at Cahuenga Pass, where Universal Studios is today, on the flats down there at the bottom. And the battle wasn't really much of a conflict in terms of casualties. A horse was killed and a guy's hat was shot off, and that was about it. There really weren't too many people who were wounded at all. But Micheltorena could see that he was outnumbered. And the other important factor was that Micheltorena had on his side a number of Americans and Europeans, including John Sutter from Sutter's Mill up in Sacramento, as well as some of the members of the party who came with Roland and Workman in 1841, who had moved to the north. Likewise, Pico had his group of extranjeros or foreigners, and he had a small little division or platoon that was captained by William Workman, and John Rowland was the lieutenant. They were given these titles by Pico. And so Workman and Rowland and Benjamin Wilson engaged in discussion with some of the people on the other side that they knew. In fact, Pico got kind of upset about that, rode over on his horse and lambasted Workman for communicating with the enemy without getting his permission. But what wound up happening is they did negotiate a settlement. Micheltorena agreed to leave, and Pico became governor of Alta California. This is February 1845. Pico moves the capital to Los Angeles, but there's also awareness that the United States is getting more aggressive about its expansion. And within a year or so, you're going to have war break out between the United States and Mexico. Now, after that battle of Cahuenga Pass, where Pico became governor, he gave out some land grants and other gifts to William Workman. And this is probably what you might call spoils of war of a sort, where somebody helped him out, and so you get the reward from that. As one example, the lands of the San Gabriel mission depicted here, the missions were secularized by the Mexican government in the 1830s, 1833, 34. Secularized means basically they were closed down as missions. The buildings were converted into parish churches, but the lands could be made available for private ownership through land grants. Just to give you an idea of how important that was, prior to secularization, there were only a handful of land grants in Alta California, probably about 50. In the 12 years after that, after secularization, hundreds of land grants were made because the missions had controlled so much of the property in Alta California that the Spanish and Mexicans had settled, that having those missions shut down and having that land opened up was a huge boon to private settlement. In this case, the lands immediately surrounding the San Gabriel mission were granted by Pico to a gentleman from Scotland named Hugo Reed and to William Workman. Workman was also given San Clemente Island, along with the governor's brother, Andres Pico, and a small island off the coast of San Francisco, often referred to as Bird Island or Alcatraz. And so he was given these properties, presumably because of the services he had rendered to the new governor. Now, Workman didn't get to keep any of these. Over time, things were taken. So San Clemente and Alcatraz were seized by the American military and remain American government possessions today, whereas the San Gabriel mission was lost in a court decision many years later. But it shows that Workman and Pico were becoming very close and that they had a long-standing friendship over many years. So as I said, Pico wasn't governor for very long before it became common knowledge that the Americans were going to invade Mexico. It was essentially a pretext. There had been claims by the United States that they'd been attacked on a disputed border area in Texas by the Mexican forces, who of course said that wasn't the case. They were in their own territory. We had a habit of doing that in the Spanish-American War and also with the Tonkin Gulf resolution in Vietnam. So it's not surprising that that happened. And the United States did wind up invading Mexican California in the summer of 1846. There was an initial push and seizure of Los Angeles that summer. A garrison was left behind with a young lieutenant named Gillespie, who decided to impose really strict curfews and sort of martial law on the pueblo, which really made the locals unhappy, as you can imagine. And so it didn't take long for them to rise up and basically throw Gillespie and his small force out. They wound up retreating down to a ship anchored off the shore near San Pedro and waited for reinforcements to arrive. Now, while that was happening, the original commander who seized Los Angeles, a naval commodore named Robert Stockton, the city up north is named for him, had gone down to San Diego thinking that Los Angeles was secure, then realized it wasn't. So he decided to wait until an army force came overland from New Mexico, and then there would be a joint march up the coast to retake Los Angeles. In the meantime, there was an attempt of some of the American forces to go back to Los Angeles from San Pedro, but the Californios decided to head down that direction and did a very clever thing, actually. They didn't have a large force. What they did is they rode around very quickly and created a lot of noise and dust and made the Americans think there were a lot more other Californios defending the area than there were. And it turned out that even though John Temple, who owned a store in Los Angeles and had been supplying the Americans with goods from his store. His wife, Rafaela Cota, this is their son-in-law, by the way, Gregorio de Huria, Rafaela actually was helping out the Californios because those were her people. So this is an illustration of where you get a married couple where the husband is, if not outright supporting the Americans, at least supplying them, making money off that, whereas Rafaela Cota de Temple is doing what she does for her own people by helping them and supporting them when she can. She made arrangements for them to have supplies and food and apparently even some armaments as they were defending California from the American invasion. Now, what happened also towards the latter part of the summer and into the early fall is that as the Californios retook Los Angeles, some Americans and Europeans decided to gather at a rancho east of Los Angeles called Santa Ana del Chino at the home of Isaac Williams, who was an American and a Mexican citizen, had married into the Lugo family, who owned the rancho for a period of time. And at his house, which is now in the city of Chino Hills, they were gathered for protection. The Californios were alarmed that they were going to try to instigate violence against them. So a Californio force besieged the house. And in fact, some of the Lugos were there besieging their own brother-in-law. And the Americans were captured and taken to what was called Pardon Blanco, an area of bluffs across the LA River from the Pueblo of Los Angeles. It's now Boyle Heights, and held prisoner there for several months. And there were concerns that they may actually either be taken to Mexico as prisoners or even shot at one point. That didn't happen. They were kept in the Pardon Blanco area. But Workman and Ignacio Palomares, who owned Rancho San Jose, which is the Pomona area today, got together and arranged to have those prisoners freed on parole. In other words, if they guaranteed that they would not get involved in any conflicts or try to upset the Californios taking control of Los Angeles, then they would be allowed to go back to their homes. That's what wound up happening. So Workman had a role in that. He was also a mediator. I mentioned before that Stockton was in San Diego, and when the Army force came from Mexico, led by a guy named Stephen Watts Kearny and Stockton combined their forces and marched up from San Diego. When they got to San Juan Capistrano, and presumably to the mission, Workman rode down from La Puente and delivered a letter from the commanding figure in California, military figure. Pio Pico was the governor, had left to go to Mexico to seek aid, which was not forthcoming. But there had been other people responsible for what was happening to defend California from the California perspective. And so Workman delivered a letter from one of them to Stockton and arranged an amnesty. So in other words, when the Americans arrived at Los Angeles, whatever the outcome was going to be, presumably an American victory from their standpoint, they would agree to an amnesty so that the Californios could return to their homes after that and would not be arrested, held prisoner, prosecuted in any way. So again, this is Workman writing down to meet with Stockton and arrange this, giving him something of an important role as well. When the Americans arrived in our area, they got up through Orange County, came up along the what was then the San Gabriel River Channel. And we know this is the Rio Hondo. So this is the Montebello Hills. And there is a California state landmark plaque that is on the western side of that. I think it's technically in the city of Montebello. And that marker is about this passage of the San Gabriel River, sometimes called the Battle of the San Gabriel River. The Americans coming in from what is now Orange County, the Californios defending the opposite side of the river. There was some gunfire and some action going on there. I think the Californios knew that they were not so much undermanned in terms of the number of people, but they didn't have the weaponry that the Americans did. It was really a major disadvantage for them being in an isolated area for so long. So the Mexican forces, meaning the Californios, then retreated backwards and decided to have one more stand as the Americans crossed the river. So that was January 8th. 1847. The next day, the Americans moved westward and they arrived in what is now a really gritty industrial area in the city of Vernon and Huntington Park being nearby, those places south and a little bit east of Los Angeles. And there was another engagement that was referred to as the Battle of Los Angeles. And so the Americans took their position. There was a depression in the area. The Californios emerged from there and swung around and did a little bit of a maneuver on both sides, trying to do a little pincer movement, hoping they could maybe get lucky and find a way to disrupt the Americans. It did not work. And so the Californios, again, not having the kinds of ammunition and armaments that the Americans did, had to retreat and went back towards Los Angeles and in other directions. The Americans then crossed the Los Angeles River and then marched straight north into town. This is basically the road from San Pedro into Los Angeles. And on January 10th, they entered the Pueblo. 3 people showed up with a white flag of truce, and one of those was William Workman. So perhaps being British, that had a sense of neutrality that served him well in that capacity. And so that appears to be perhaps one of the main reasons why he had such a prominent role in these things towards the end of the war. So that really is a part of course, a bigger picture, which I referred to earlier. And like I said, you've got this movement west, the annexation of Texas by the United States after 9 years of that being an independent country. There was an agreement made with Great Britain about what was referred to as the Oregon Country or Oregon Territory. That was in 1846, the year that the Mexican-American War really broke out and expanded. And even treaties with Canada, as I mentioned before, up in New England and a little bit of the Midwest as well. So it was really a continued push of the United States. It's interesting to see things like, this is a fairly old map, but the term unorganized territory, as if the native peoples had no organizational skills whatsoever. We know that, of course, not to be true, but that's just the way those things tended to get referred to. Now, as the war ends and a treaty is being drawn up, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, a couple of things to mention about this. One is that the gentleman who was sent by the United States to negotiate with the Mexicans was a guy named Nicholas Trist. And Trist was given his portfolio. In other words, he was given his instructions on how to negotiate, but he decided to go outside of that. And his defense was, what I was told in Washington about how to deal with this was not what was going to be real and practical on the ground. I had to make adjustments for the conditions that were there. One of the things Trist agreed to was that any of the land grants made under Spain and Mexico would automatically be considered legitimate in the transition to the United States. When President Polk and members of his cabinet and when members of Congress, especially the Senate, found out about that, they were furious because that was not something Trist was supposed to do. And so the article of that treaty was taken out by a vote of the Senate before the treaty was ratified by the United States. A lot of people to this day still think because the article was in the treaty that he drafted that it held and that stayed part of it, which is not the case at all. So I mention that now to kind of set the table for some of the future presentations on this topic, because it'll have to do with some important parts of the Workman and Temple family story as well. But also 9 days before the Mexican Congress ratified the treaty, they did that February 2, 1848. On January 24th, a mill was being built in the Sierra Nevada mountains east of what became Sacramento, built by John Sutter, who I mentioned earlier. And his foreman for that project, James Marshall, noticed in the American River next to the mill some shiny stuff floating there. And that, of course, was the gold that ushered in the great gold rush of 1848, 49, and afterwards. So there are a lot of things were happening very quickly. Going back just to a bit of the post-war politics, Jonathan Temple, being one of the prominent foreigners in the area, became a member of the town council. What the American military authorities decided to do after the war was not to change the structure of government. They felt that would be too much to ask for, too difficult to implement. And so the military authorities who governed California basically for about 3.5 years, they left the positions in place and the structures in place. So the ayuntamiento, or the town council, was retained, and Temple became part of the ayuntamiento. One of the things he was involved in that's pretty important for the future development of Los Angeles was a survey done by an Army lieutenant named Edward O.C. Ord. There's a Fort Ord up in Northern California named for him. And what the local authorities wanted to do was to establish a more precise survey of the Pueblo. And Ord was hired to do that. Now, it was going to cost money, and the Pueblo didn't have a tax structure to be able to afford it. The cost was $3,000. And so there was a bit of a dilemma there. Temple stepped up and said, I will cover the cost of that. And then once they do the surveying, any future sales of lots that are laid out and mapped out in the survey, then I can be paid back from the proceeds of those sales. In other words, public land within the pueblo that would be sold to private citizens. But one of the things that stands out about this map, you can probably see it immediately, is the difference between the American standard of doing things and what had existed under Spain and Mexico. It's kind of like the diseños I mentioned earlier with the ranchos, how the La Puente one was precise with certain survey lines, but most of them were not. And that's because, again, under Spain and Mexico, there was no need to have precision as long as the people understood whose land was where and they could work that out. And so this is the layout of property under the Spanish and Mexican period, and it worked perfectly fine for their needs. But once the survey was done by Ord, and it didn't really matter where the topography was so much, is they laid out the neat grids that you often see in surveying. And so this is really a reflection of the change between the Spanish and Mexican eras and the American eras depicted on a map like this. By the way, with Temple, he was, of course, paying up front for this. So he thought that gave him the privilege of being able to approach the surveyors. A guy named William Rich Hutton, whose name is on here, did most of the actual work. And Hutton wrote in his diary, which was later partially published, that Temple frequently interrupted him in his work to criticize him and ask questions. Why is that stake going there? No, the line should be over there. And you could tell that Hutton was pretty unhappy with being interrupted by a civilian, somebody who really was not a surveyor, but because I guess Temple fronted the money, he felt he had the right to be able to criticize what Hutton was doing. Another thing, again, to bring out with respect to those ranchos is that you have these families starting to become pretty prominent. Los Cerritos, as I said, was 27,000 acres down here in the South Bay area of Los Angeles County. The La Puente land grant was expanded. So when Pio Pico became governor, and about the same time that he gave Workman Alcatraz and San Clemente Island and the San Gabriel Mission grant, he re-granted the La Puente Rancho. Now, one of the strange things about that is that John Rowland had to make the petition for the new grant. And he wrote in there that it was an accident that William Workman's name was left off the original grant in 1842. That obviously is not the case. You don't forget your best friend living less than a mile from you when you put your land grant petition in. But it goes back to what I said earlier about what happened in New Mexico, the seduce and confuse thing. And it may be, we don't have any documentation of it, and that probably never will, but Workman probably had to keep a low profile when he came out here. There was one rumor that he had been involved directly in an attempt to assassinate the governor of New Mexico, Manuel Armijo. Armijo was the one who wrote that letter to the California officials later on. So that may be a reason why Rowland got the land grant in his name only. Even when a Mexican era census was done in 1844, it wasn't like you went on vacation and just left town for a while. Workman didn't even show up on the census. I would imagine he and his family were there, but whether they just didn't answer the door or went off for the day or whatever it is, it's puzzling, some of these things. But in any case, the land grant of 1845 in the summer, the re-grant, included Workman's name and expanded La Puente from 17,000 acres to about 49,000, which was the maximum allowable for most land grants. And so you can see why La Puente is so much bigger than the other properties for the most part in the region. San Rafael, which is the Glendale, Burbank area, was about the same size. The only one that was bigger was because it was the former lands of San Fernando Mission. It was not a separate rancho, so that was much bigger. And the Pico brothers wound up owning that property, not surprisingly, with Pio Pico being governor at one point. But what we'll talk about in future editions of this series is that the Workman and Temple families will expand, own more ranchos, or have interest in more ranchos as time goes on. And we'll pick up that part of the story with the future presentations here. With the discovery of gold, and I'll just introduce this part of it again, and we'll talk more about this next time, is that as you have huge numbers of people coming to the area, it's important to point out just quickly that California had very few people living in it in terms of Spanish, Mexican, Americans, and Europeans. We're probably 10,000 people in that category, and tens of thousands of native people still living in California. But the gold rush introduced 250,000 people within just a few years from very different parts of the world, Australia, China, Europe, South America, the United States, people of different ethnic groups and cultures going to one place at one time. This has not happened in many places in world history quite like this. And there was no real established government because the military was supposed to be in charge, but where were most of the soldiers? They were AWOL. They had left their post to go dig for gold. There was not a really strong government here. And Congress was struggling what to do with California because its geographical position was both north and south. And states were admitted after a compromise involving Missouri in 1820 on the basis of a southern state, then a northern state, slave, then free in order after 1820. Well, California put a wrench in that because it was both north and south. So Congress was not sure what to do. And we'll pick up more of that story in the next presentation. But that posed a lot of problems once the gold rush happened, because it was very little law and order, for example. And that was obviously very problematic. What it did do for the ranchers here in greater Los Angeles is it provided them untold economic opportunities. The hide and tallow trade that existed before the gold rush could be somewhat successful, but it was limited. And a lot of it was trade by barter rather than cash sales. But with gold, with people coming out here who need fresh meat, for example, the cattle ranchers of this area realized there was a tremendous opportunity to make a good deal of money and make hay while the sun shines, as the old saying goes. So if we wrap up this presentation, we'll talk more about the effects of that later on. Yes, Alex.
We've got a question coming in from Chris. He just wants to clarify. Did you say that Workman was now included on the re-grant of Rancho La Puente?
That's right. So in 1842, when Roland went to get the grant, it was only in his name. In 1845, in the summer, so roughly three years later, Roland submitted this petition and said, yeah, we accidentally left my partner William Workman's name off the grant, which was kind of a ridiculous claim. And then, yeah, Workman was added as official owner then. So what we'll talk about in the next presentation in January is that movement into the gold rush years, the decade of the 1850s. Lots of exciting things happening, not just the economic opportunities, which could be shown in a photo like this, which is about 1852. I'm sure the family could not have afforded, dresses like that for Workman's daughter, for example, without having that wealth. Workman going back for his only visit home to England during that period. But also some of the challenges that happened during that decade, where there was rampant violence, uncertainty economically as the gold rush came to a close, and efforts to try to move more into a business arena as Los Angeles began to change in character. So those are the kinds of things we'll talk about in the next presentation. And just for your knowledge, I don't know if this will be the exact title, but this is what I'm thinking of, is for the 1850s, part of the story of the families. And we're looking at Sunday, January 17th at 2 o'clock. In the meantime, we have some great upcoming programs. Our nonfiction book club, which has been on hiatus for a while, is coming back virtually, and a very timely topic of women's suffrage. And this will be the first of 3 sessions. There will be a talk next weekend. We have had a Ticket to the 20s event at this time of the year for many years. Of course, we can't have that given current conditions. So we'll take you on a virtual tour through the 20s with artifacts in the museum's collection next Sunday, the 4th at 2 o'clock. And then colleague Jenny Trulock is presenting another in the great series of presentations on the female justice topic on Clara Phillips, the Tiger Lady. So you'll have to tune in and find out why she was called the Tiger Lady. That will be Sunday the 18th at 2. As you can see here, you can sign up at that address, homesteadmuseum.org/upcoming/events. And please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So with that, I'll turn things back over to Alex. Thank you all very much, and I hope to see you at the next presentation.
All right. So Chris says, thanks very much. I love your presentations.
Thank you.
Petra is asking, is this being recorded? Yes, it is being recorded. We have on our website under About Us, you'll see a link to our recorded program archive. Most of the programs we've offered during the pandemic have been recorded here on Zoom and are available there for you to watch at any time. There's also, if you're following us on Facebook, it's in the chat today. Clark says, thank you, Paul, always fascinating.
Thank you.
All right, we'll give folks a minute or two here to ask any other questions they may have. It's nice to see many familiar names here and a lot of new names of folks joining us from near and far. All right, let's see if any more come in here. Let's take a look at the chat real quick. Leslie says, many thanks, very interesting. Janet says, thank you. All right, we'll give folks one more minute. We know typing takes a little bit more time than asking a question live in person, so we do want to be patient, right, Paul?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Okay, folks, well, I think that's a wrap for us. Thanks again so much for spending part of your Sunday here with us. You will be receiving an email with a link to a very short evaluation that we ask you fill out for us. Your opinion matters. We like to hear what you have to say to help us improve and do better. And oh, here's something else coming in. See, we needed some time for that keyboard action, right? Oh, Chris asks, so this is a big question, Paul. How far into California history do you plan to take us?
Well, we can go up until 1930, pretty much, maybe even a little beyond that. So I haven't plotted that out entirely, but depending on interest, I suppose we could probably do several more of these for sure. So, yeah.
Yeah, Alan says, as always, a great job. Joyce Locatel asks, please explain La Puente's name as opposed to El Puente.
Sure thing. So the explorers in the Portola expedition, when they came across the Puente Hills into what they called San Miguel Valley, this is 1769 in the summer, they had to build a bridge of poles to cross San Jose Creek. In Father Juan Crespi's diary, he was one of the members of that group. And he was from Catalonia. So you're talking about the area of northeastern Spain that they're still agitating for independence there. The Catalan dialect of that time period allowed you to use the masculine or feminine for a bridge depending on the context. So in his diary, it says that they built a bridge, La Puente, across the creek. So that's where that name came from. So our modern Spanish is El Puente, but at that time with the Catalan dialect, they could use La Puente.
Okay, and one more comment coming in here from Gary Temple. Always great to hear more about the family and how they lived during the transition from Mexico to the USA. I think he might be a little biased, though.
Quite possibly. Yeah, good to hear from you, Gary. I'm going to type in my email address, and if anybody has any questions subsequently, they can. I was going to try. Let's see, why can't I do it? Let's see. There we go. If you have any questions, you can contact me that way.
Maybe one more there.
Make sure
Okay. All right, folks. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you here, some of you hopefully next weekend for Paul's tour through the 1920s. And again, please do follow us online, and we'll hope to see you at future programs. Thank you so much.
Okay, take care. Thank you.